to start. I'm not too sure if I'm audible or not.
Yeah.
I am. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for coming on this wonderful of days. It's Gender and Finance Day, as I'm sure you're all aware. So it's the perfect day to have our event. And thank you very much, first of all, to the Barbados Pavilion for making it possible. I know these are really stressful days. And it's been really sort of nice in preparation, working with you all. So thank you very much. I'll get going as soon as possible because unfortunately Ricardo will need to leave us slightly sooner than expected. But I do have enough time, hopefully, to briefly present our wonderful panel. To my left is Katie Tobin from the Women's Environment and Development Organization. To Katie's left is Marisa Hutchinson from the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. To Marissa's left is Tetet Laron from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and to Tetet's left is Ricardo Marshall from the Roofs to Reefs program and representative of the Prime Minister's Office, Barbados. And what we're going to attempt today is to speak to the transformation of the international financial architecture through a feminist lens, a call which grew very large at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where I think it's fair to say that Mia Mottley and the Barbados government were the real driving forces behind this call to action, sort of particularly addressing unsustainable levels of debt in the global south, one of the several aspects proposed in the BI, in the Bridgetown Initiative. What is, of course, clear is that the impacts of climate change are determined intersectionally, they're gendered, and that's why any response to climate change will also have to take in a gendered and a feminist lens. And that's what we're going to speak to today. So I'd like to ask Katie to please kick us off on the gendered impacts of climate change.
Thanks, David, and thanks so much to Barbados for hosting us. So the Women's Environment and Development Organization, where I work, works on feminist climate justice. So I'll start with just a very brief explanation of why climate change is a gendered issue. As David said, people's experiences of the climate crisis are shaped by their identities and the ways that those determine their access to resources and the power they have to make decisions. So for women and girls and gender-expansive people, as well as other marginalized communities, that means they're more affected by climate change and environmental crises, especially because women and feminized people are more likely to work in sectors like tourism, which are the first to be affected in a climate situation. And also women then take on more unpaid care work to be the sort of shock absorbers in a crisis situation. And this is why the experiences and the priorities and the perspectives and expertise of women and girls need to be forefronted in climate policies and plans. But we know that these plans, that climate policies and systems are shaped, as are economic policies and systems, and I suppose all others, by patriarchy, by capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, and that therefore the multilateral apparatus surrounding them is also shaped by white supremacist, heteropatriarchal capitalism. And we may have noticed it is failing to deliver on the kinds of climate justice that would put the needs of women and all people facing marginalization at the center. And we know that over the past year, we have seen a victory in the fight for an establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, a victory for the Global South and for all of us who believe in global justice. But we also have seen that the numbers pledged so far are in no way close to actually responding to the needs of what's required for frontline states and communities. I mean, we're talking millions, and we know that that's not the scale we need. We know that the system, this climate finance, climate multilateral negotiations are not working for SIDS, for countries of the Global South, and especially for the women, girls, and gender diverse people who live in there, and those facing discrimination in all societies, North and South. And so we really, as feminists with a structural analysis, look at the failures so far of climate finance as situated within a bigger picture of how power operates, both over there in the negotiation rooms, but also in Washington, D.C. at the IMF and World Bank, and in Paris at the OECD, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, no one has pointed this out with more power and authority than Prime Minister Motley. And we really appreciate the leadership of Barbados in putting forward an understanding of climate and development finance that's rooted in the need for reparations and really grounded in the moral leadership of Barbados' Prime Minister. So we want to take a moment to appreciate that. And for us, reparations is a key part of our understanding of climate finance, of climate justice, that rather than placing a Band-Aid over the wounds of the current economic and climate system, we really need to be transforming the root causes, looking at the systems that govern it. And it's kind of interesting to see that this call for reparations is becoming more mainstream. I mean, even UN Women in their feminist climate justice framework that they launched yesterday mentioned reparations as one of their 4 key pillars. But what that framing means that climate finance should not be regarded as a matter of solidarity or charity or something nice to do, but of obligations, and as a debt that's owed from the global north to the global south, and not, by the way, the other way around. And this is in line with the hard-fought principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that's enshrined in the Rio Declaration as well as in the Framework Convention itself, and that we have to collectively push global north countries to adhere to. So we really appreciate the framing within the Bridgetown Initiative of the sort of links between climate and development finance and sort of the overall regimes in terms of what's needed to shake up the multilateral system. And as Professor Persaud has said, Bridgetown is the only initiative that's actually talking at the scale required. That's not talking millions or billions, it's talking trillions and how we actually get them. So as feminists with a structural analysis, I think we were in agreement with the diagnosis of the problem, and where we perhaps differ on some things is in the solutions proposed. So, we were talking about climate finance as reparations. For us, that also means that no climate finance should be delivered as loans. So whether they're concessional, obviously more concessional, longer term would be better than the current situation. But for feminists, for those with a justice lens, even that is not enough. We have to really be pushing for climate finance as grants, as rooted in public funds for public goods, and as accessible, including to local communities and women's organizations. And we know this because we know that public services, public funding is essential for the kinds of things that make women's lives better, make all marginalized people's lives better. And we know that the sort of loans or the private sector emphasis, there's been lots of research that shows that that doesn't work for the majority of the world, that this kind of de-risking or encouraging investments, or somehow if we can just get the private sector to come in, it's not happening. And it's really dangerous in terms of human rights and women's rights. So that's why also, in terms of the overall financial landscape, we also need to be talking about debt cancellation, which we very much also appreciate the Prime Minister Motley's leadership on, and the mentions of debt cancellation in the Bridgetown Initiative. And we would hope that that would be the sort of one of the pieces of it that got more traction and more attention than it has so far. Because again, it comes down to the obligations of global north countries for climate finance, also for development finance, rather than displacing that responsibility onto the multilateral development banks or the private sector. So the final piece here is the role of the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, which are increasingly, as we're seeing, kind of encroaching into the climate arena, as they are also with the gender arena. Both the IMF and the World Bank have climate and gender strategies in various stages of development. And we as feminists really push back on that, because the democratic deficits in those institutions, which Bridgetown itself points out, are exactly why they don't belong in the climate sphere. We don't want their help on women's rights. We want them to stop doing what they have been doing before they even talk about anything else. We see that also in special drawing rights. The way that the IMF is set up means that until we change the quota system, it's not possible for special drawing rights to really be delivered to the places that need them the most. Of the 650 billion of the new SDR issuance in 2021, only 7 billion of that has gone to low-income countries. So that's the kind of thing we need to shift, but it's a little bit challenging given the governance structure and the US veto. And we know that the austerity measures that are imposed by the IMF and the bank disproportionately impact low-income countries that are obligated for various reasons to take on IMF programs. And then within those countries, they disproportionately affect women and gender diverse people by reducing access to decent work and gender responsive public services. So again, this is not the answer, and we have to be looking at climate finance within this larger picture of economic justice and a shift that's required from extractive models to feminist agendas that center care for people and planet. So we know that the past couple days in this COP in general, we're talking a lot about just transition. So for us as feminists, that means a feminist, fossil fuel-free future, fast, fair, forever, that's also looking at gender justice within this broader framework of workers' rights and the broader transition. So the Women and Gender constituency and our friends are wearing yellow today for just transition. And we're also having a reception right after this in the Women and Gender constituency pavilion. So you're all invited to continue this conversation with us there. So thanks so much. David, back to you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for setting us off, for setting this really important framing for our discussion, going through the risks of climate change exacerbating gender inequality, but also the response to climate change further exacerbating that inequality. And as one of the key responses to climate change, I think the Bridgetown Initiative has been really instrumental in getting the discussions talking around climate finance. So with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Ricardo, if you could maybe set the scene a bit in terms of where we're at in terms of transforming the global financial architecture, and maybe also specifically around the Bridgetown initiative. That would be great.
Yeah, I think most people. Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Katie, for the opportunity. I think most people are quite familiar with the Bridgetown initiative, but there's a lot that went into taking that concept forward that I don't necessarily believe that everybody pays attention to. The reality is that the Bretton Woods institutions came into place at a time when the majority of the countries that currently negotiate in the climate sphere and are current borrowing members of those institutions did not even exist. We are recently out of a colonial past that has a significant bearing on what it is we face today. And I wanted to take it a little bit away from Bridgetown into one or two areas that I'm not sure that enough people are studying or understanding what is going on. There was a move to negotiate the Paris Agreement, and there were a number of positive reasons to negotiate the Paris Agreement. But the reality is that since the Paris Agreement has come into force, there are a number of developed countries that have been pushing for parity between the Paris Agreement and the Convention. And what this is really about is rewriting the text of the Convention to favor developed countries. Developing countries, if you look at CBDR, if you look at Article 4.5 of the Paris Agreement, if you look at Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, developed countries are supposed to take the lead in providing financing for developing countries. Instead, you have a circumstance where people are trying something that we all know, revisionist history. So CBDR is to be out the door. Developing countries who have only just started on the path are supposed to step up and take responsibility for paying for that which they have not been the primary contributors to. Even when you look at the current emissions from China, 79% of your emissions circumstance currently comes from developed countries. And if you take their colonial past into account and really start doing the math, it looks even worse for the likes of the United Kingdom and France and Portugal. These are realities that we have to live with, things that most people don't know. They've been pushing Article 21C. Most people don't even know what Article 21C is. It is one of the shortest subarticles of the entire Paris Agreement. But it says make finance flows consistent with low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. What the developed countries have sought to do is to control MDB and IFI financing and push it towards low GHG emissions projects and indicate to the developing world that they do not and should not fund projects that do not align to low GHG emissions. I remember on a similar panel, we were in Bonn, and I said, the unfortunate thing is that those of us in the developing countries, men, women, children, if you're gender fluid, if you're old, if you're young, when the sea comes to claim you, you will all go. For all of us, we have gender issues and other inequalities that we have to deal with nationally. But like adaptation, those are nationally driven issues. We have a just transition that we have to look at. And I use a very clear example in the Barbadian setting where when you look at the greening of the transportation sector, we tend to have in Barbados gas attendants at petrol stations, and most gas attendants are women. Women pump gas. If you go away from gasoline-powered vehicles, you have to consider how you're going to address that in the just transition. But men repair cars and fix air conditioning units for vehicles. So when you're doing that, you have to consider men from that perspective in your transportation just transition. And what we're getting at here is that we cannot afford to simply say that we're going to take a feminist lens and look at it and identify where women are disadvantaged. We have to do that. But we also need to take that lens and take it into an understanding of where those gender issues are and fully vacillate those. The other bit where we're failing is that the just transition has to look at the just transition not just within country, but between North and South. And we're failing in that regard. When we go back to the issue of Article 2.1c, and the reason why I said when the sea comes calling, if you have a coastal defense structure, that coastal defense structure includes high marine grade, high strength concrete. It includes steel. It includes the fact that you're going to have to test it. You're going to have to reject lots of loads. And so chances are the same structure that you are relying upon to protect you in your adaptation does not align to a low GHG circumstance. But people like to forget that and forget that 21C specifically states climate resilient development separate and distinct from low GHG. But there's a reason why developed countries want to do that. They want everybody to pay the price for the benefits that have come to them. So everybody is now supposed to, at the same rate, reduce emissions, take the same responsibility for it. And that is the issue. They want to catch us up in all of the other things that are going on. We know that gender is important. We sit in meetings and we try to find at least gender parity when it comes to co-chairing of groups. We're seeking gender parity when it comes to the issues of men versus women in delegations. So there are those steps being taken here and by those parties. But the issue is a much broader and much deeper issue. And I keep saying to people, we are only as vulnerable as the most vulnerable in our society. And we need to know who those people are, and we need to understand how that changes with the changing topic and the changing circumstance. We have a very heterogeneous region in the Caribbean. In Barbados, we have an aging population. In many other countries in the region, we have a very youthful population. Those come with different challenges. But it means that we have to take those challenges on board. In Barbados, it means that we have to address social services for the elderly. In other countries, we have to concentrate on opportunities for youth. We also have to look at the things that are changing in our society. Marissa can tell you, when you look at the University of the West Indies, 80% of those leaving the university with qualifications are women. Young men in the Caribbean region are absolutely in crisis. And I want us to remember those things, and unfortunately, I have to run shortly. And I just want to throw out the challenge in the gender sphere. Continue to lead and to fight for women's rights. Continue to lead and to fight for the empowerment and protection of girls and women in the society. But take your gender roles seriously. And where there's a call for young men, for elderly to be championed, let us become champions of all of those disenfranchised people. Let the Bridgetown Initiative stand as a cry that does not need to label itself internationally as addressing gender, aged, looking at what your sexual orientation is. Let that be the broader package. And let us make sure that as we walk that journey at the national level, and wherever you go into countries to promote what you do, encourage that national level programming and commitment. It is an interesting thing. Karima is in the back of the room. She would tell you, when we are in meetings in the Caribbean, especially in Barbados, I don't think we look around and we study who's a man in the room and who's a woman. Any voice in that room, once you're in that room, that voice counts. And we need to take that approach across the region. And it is imperative that if we are to succeed in what we're doing, that we champion the most vulnerable in our society. If you have a shortage of water, women and girls suffer more every single time. Every time. If you have a shortage of financing for issues, the nation suffers. And so what you need to do is to address those national issues and to ensure that within that national context, you are addressing the issues of gender and of the related concerns, especially when you remember the fact that we are fighting in the case of Barbados, in a country that not that long ago, men, women, and children of my complexion were chattel. We were property. We had to line up to be told when to eat and what to eat and how. And we were thrown into, as my grandmother would say, a cold and uncaring world in which we have had to try to find our place. I apologize for having to rush, and I hope that this is a fruitful session. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I just want to encourage you to continue to champion the cause of women and girls, but to not forget the other vulnerable persons in the society and to recall that we need finance in every sphere if we're to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for lending us your time in this busy phase, for making that link to the negotiations, but also illustrating this topic so vividly from your experiences. So thank you very much. Marissa, I would love to hear your response, and also maybe if you could tell us a bit about your experiences, which might be similar but might also diverge in some cases.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As David introduced me before, my name is Marissa. I'm actually a Barbadian also, so this is a pleasure to speak on this specific initiative, the British Initiative. Apologies, I don't have my notes printed or written, but they're on my phone, and this is what technology does to us. But I'm grateful for Ricardo's interjection with regards to his presentation speaking to vulnerable groups, etc., because that is the direction in which I was going. So I was thinking around like how we think about addressing climate change, environmental degradation, and just speaking a lot about loss and damage with the establishment of the new loss and damage fund. And in terms of addressing it, we do need gender, we do need to be more feminist in our approaches, but from my perspective also, we need to be very much people-centered in terms of ensuring that when we're talking about those impacted by climate change and when funds and resources support those persons, that it's not just women and girls broadly, or men and boys, as we're saying, or the elderly, but we need to focus on other vulnerable groups. We have to think about the LGBTI community. We have to think about people living with disabilities, and there are a lot of groups that often go missing in these conversations, especially for, say, not just like rural communities, but also indigenous people. So in terms of the way in which we take it forward, I think what is necessary is to accommodate the unique needs of communities, but also taking time to analyze the specific needs. I think a lot of time we are building projects and initiatives based on sometimes like our very local or national level consensus. And a lot of times those aren't up to date, well, from what you see. Because a lot of times you could go and you could Google and you could research, but a lot of times they're, done years ago, etc. So taking time to actually carry out careful analysis, whether it's like specific needs assessments in countries or focusing on engaging with specific groups. I think a lot of that is missing. And I know like in our different organizations here, we do this in our work, but I think it's also like a bigger responsibility of states to take that on. So I wouldn't go into a lot of things that Ricardo said, but also Katie. But also in the context of climate change, we know that the Barbados government, and I can say so myself proudly, that the support, the intention of the British Initiative is good, and we believe that is good. But we also need that in addressing, say, not just economic, but non-economic losses that we often hear the Global South especially speak about, whether it's culture, identity, even dignity when it comes to Indigenous people, but that we must be mindful in the ways in which it impacts people. And this is a huge concern for many of us coming from the Global South. And as Katie said, we don't want it in the form of loans. We can't repay loans. And it's just a heavy debt burden on our states constantly. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me well, cause I can, yeah. So what I think about when it comes to vulnerable communities is not just having them be a part of the process, but actually helping in building their capacity and engaging them. I think that is one of the most important things. And I'm not just speaking about what we often speak about in terms of engaging them in decision making processes, but having them engage in a way that it doesn't even have to be town hall meetings, but being within the communities, engaging. Like we all have different organizations within countries. So even within Barbados, we have organizations with LGBTI people. We have people living with disabilities, etc. Thinking about how we engage with them in consultation, not just you come in, you take the information, and then that's it. But in consultation, whereas there's somewhat a responsibility to these communities and a report back. Like this is what we've decided we would do. This is what the analysis is. And I really like Ricardo's reference to the elderly because even though in most cases we're talking about vulnerable group, ageism is very much still there, and we're not really considering the elderly a lot. So I really did like that reference in terms of thinking about persons based on age. Um, um, what I always think about too, and when I heard of the Bridgetown Initiative, it was thinking around like what the Caribbean, Barbados, yes, but the Caribbean and the global South have just gone through with COVID and the issues that we're facing. And we're talking about continuously developing, but the pandemic, we can't lie and not say that it wasn't 3 years long. It probably felt longer, but it was only 3 years, and the impact that it has had on us and still has. So thinking about how initiatives like the Bridgetown initiatives and others, well, we're hoping that the Bridgetown initiative is the groundbreaking one, is that it is more, in a sense, impactful and it supports and addresses the needs of those significantly impacted by climate change, but also to it lends some support in that, like, for example, what I'm thinking about is like how women's groups a lot or like community groups in general, how they have to work so hard when it comes to relief and recovery constantly. Like, what does that look like? And then a lot of times when we do receive loans, it doesn't go directly to the communities. So thinking about how grants could support. We know a lot of these grants are going to come through governments, but what it looks like, who does it specifically target, and having that analysis is very important. I'm going to wrap up. I see David is watching me. But also ensuring once again that the non-economic losses especially are accounted for in terms of mental health, and going back to again what Ricardo say as it relates to social services, but also then to the key needs of communities, whether it's like sacred grounds or taking into consideration their native lands, etc. And then when we talk about plans in place, but also policy, how do that, how do like funds and also accommodate policies that are people centered once again? Like we're thinking about human rights, we're thinking about again who's significantly impacted, because I mean without these things we talk about sustainable development, we talk about gender equality, etc., but if we don't have the funds that are going towards these things that are serving the communities that they're supposed to serve, then that balance is not there, or that that thought of sustainable development remains unachievable, and we know it in many cases. And I had a experience, me and Titet, where we attended a LDC's conference, and it was so crazy how developed countries were continuing to tell the LDCs, the least developed countries, you need to graduate. You need to graduate. You need to develop. And we're like, what are you giving us to develop? You know. So just thinking about that, I think is or some of the points I made. I think is a key way of thinking about addressing the debt crisis. But we also hope that in moving forward, that with the Bridgetown Initiative, that it continues to inform the process, especially of not just civil society but communities on the ground. And I do agree that most of us would know about the initiative, but again, maybe it's not reaching the correct persons, and we have to think about what does this process look like? How would it be, I guess, more accessible for persons? Like again, thinking about vulnerable people, like people with disabilities. Like, are people aware of this initiative? Is what we have to think about if we want to achieve the sustainable development that we talk about.
Thank you very much, Marissa, for talking about the importance of of viewing this issue as an intersectional issue at the community level, and not just talking about economic losses, the issue around loans versus grants and what that means for local communities, but also the issue around non-economic losses, things that you just cannot quantify, and also other crises. We're all talking about the poly crisis, so all these different crises interacting and impacting people of the Global South. You also touched on the continuation of the process, and here's where I would like to bring in Tetet. And we'll just ask, maybe you could touch on some of the principles that this work revolves around, and where the Bridgetown might go looking forward, or how that fits in with other initiatives to transform the global financial architecture.
Cannot even hear myself.
Maybe if you
Yeah.
turn it in
All
slightly.
right, now I
the-
can hear me.
Yeah, there you go.
So, I think the title of our conversation this afternoon, we need to bring it down, because this is a climate space, multilateral, blah, blah, blah. But then at the end of the day, it's about how do we grow our movement so that we can hold our leaders, hold our governments, hold these institutions accountable, not to larger shareholders, but to people and planet, right? Many times, a lot of us feel so insecure in these spaces because we're not technical enough, we don't understand all the acronyms, etc. But I think, this being Gender Day, we need to look back at the lessons from our foremothers that are still very, very much useful, very much relevant in order for us to grow our movements so that we can fulfill the task of transforming the financial architecture that so weighs us down right now, right? So I'm happy that we can have this intimate conversation. So I always like to refer back to some of the important lessons that we need to remind ourselves and the leaders. For instance, lesson number 1, hold hands and stick together, always play fair. Right? We hear about global solidarity, we hear about calls for justice, etc. But what do these spaces, what do these processes actually mean in terms of really making good on global solidarity and justice? For instance, now we've heard about operationalizing the loss and damage fund. And they think that the job is already finished because the decision has been gavelled at the opening of the scope. Nuh-uh. The job is far from over because pledges from the world leaders are in the hundreds of millions when in fact science, when in fact reality is telling us that the need for financing is in the hundreds of billions. So how do we now reconcile that fundamental disconnect about talks of operationalizing the loss and damage fund, but the amounts are like a drop in the ocean? Is that what solidarity is about? Is that what justice is all about? So there's a lot of fundamental disconnect still, and we need to really remember the lessons from our foremothers if that is going to give us the energy to challenge unjust systems, systems of oppression and exploitation. Yeah? So, for instance, this loss and damage fund and the funding arrangement, it sounds so technical, but what it basically means, we are confronting many global issues that are way above our heads. And the loss and damage fund and the funding arrangements are still not there to deliver on climate justice because it doesn't fulfill, we have many issues around how corporations, how rich people abuse the tax systems. They dodge tax systems and use many countries in the Caribbean, for instance, as tax havens. Yeah? We do not benefit from those, but they enrich themselves further. We talked about illegitimate debt. We talked about monopolies, which brings me to lesson number 2. We were told, don't take things that aren't yours. Say sorry when you hurt somebody. Clean up your mess. And it's very, very true up to this day. Because the systems that we find ourselves in still rely primarily on extraction and exploitation of the global south. Ricardo was telling us about the history of colonialism. It's not just a history, it's a continuing reality for many of us in terms of unfair trade deals, unfair investment deals, all the things that are being used and legitimized to get resources away from our countries and our people. So these systems of oppressions are still there. And we need to grow our movements in order for these leaders to realize that even with radical domestic action, Ricardo was saying about Article 2.1c, because that's all about, forcing developing countries to get into low carbon pathways. It sounds nice, but our countries and communities need adaptation and loss and damage more than getting into these low carbon pathways. I'm not saying it's not important, but in terms of priority, we barely, have our heads above the water. We don't have food, we don't have jobs and livelihood. So what is important? We have solar panels, we have renewable energy, or we have food, water, and livelihoods for our people. So this 2.1c is forcing us. It's another imposition by developed countries in order for us to be Paris aligned. Yeah, but it is not aligned with what our stomachs are saying. So which comes first? Yeah? And the most important lesson our foremothers taught us, flush. We need to flush down the system that puts profits above people and planet. And for that, we need to grow our movements. No? We can never win. No one wins, and we all end up losing if we don't flush down the system that puts corporations and individual profits and interests above the survival of our people and planet. So, in these spaces, it can be so overwhelming, but it's important for us to get back to the basics and let's get real. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Tete, for those three lessons, for those three principles, which I will definitely be remembering. And yeah, I think the question you posed right at the beginning of your input was really important. How do we grow our movements? And I think with that, I would like to open the floor to questions. I'm not too sure if we have a microphone. There's a microphone just here on the seat. I don't know if this one is working or not. I'm not. We have one question here. Are there any other questions? Two questions at the front. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe we can invite Karima here.
Okay,
Would
brilliant.
you like to come up and?
Yay!
Okay, my first question is for Marisa. Brilliant overview of the work on gender that has been done for so many years. I mean, it's a brilliant conversation, and I personally, being in the public sector space and then in the climate change space, I've seen how this conversation on gender has evolved. We started off with gender mainstreaming, gender plans, then it became Jesse plans, and then it became JETSI plans, lots of action plans. But my question to you is, if I were to to ask you to identify one model that development institutions or governments or what have you look up, and they need to follow, what would be that model, in terms of achieving gender outcomes, right? That's one question. And the other is for Barbados. Brilliant, the Bridgetown Initiative is one of those important, sort of agendas in the, climate finance, so international financial architecture reforms, in the toolkit. It's a very important agenda item there. I think, I don't know if you're across, but next year we have the UN Secretary General's Summit of the Future, and that's where, culmination of all these, various reform pieces, reform agenda items, they're supposed to have a lending. What is your vision, and what are you expecting, for this agenda? How do you think this should evolve?
Yeah.
Mer-
Okay.
Do we want to take a couple and then? or
are
what do
there
you
more
wanna do?
questions for this round? We can begin by answering those two questions, and then we'll
Yeah.
come back and see if any more have come up. I think the first question was to you, Marissa.
Yeah, but he was looking at me.
Okay.
For me or for her? Okay.
Sorry.
Maybe you can jump in after.
So yes, on the model to follow to achieve
Yeah.
gender outcomes.
Well, I think, of course, there isn't one model because it needs to be context specific. And oh, sorry.
Hello? Better?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Katie will. We'll address the first question briefly first, and then we'll come to you, Karima.
Yeah.
Hard to hear.
So the question on whether there's one model that all these institutions should follow for to become gender transformative, no, there's not one model. I think if there were, our work would be a lot easier. It's context specific, but I think the lens of systemic analysis, of being human rights based, of looking at all the sort of cliches of bottom up rather than top down decision making. If institutions are talking to the people that they're trying to deliver for, then I think that is the model that then can shape their decision making and their governance. If we're looking at the multilateral system, so I'm going to touch on your second question also. I mean, the Summit of the Future, sure, it's an exciting opportunity to get people to care about the UN, but I don't think the sort of endless conference model is necessarily the solution here, right? We need people power to be influencing these decision-making spaces, I think primarily at national level. And of course, the global level has a role in terms of the normative framework and the highlighting of the conversations, but that's not where change is really going to come from. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katie. Karima.
Okay, are we good? Can you hear me? Good. All right. If I understood your question correctly, you're asking about where we see things going in terms of the future of the initiative and the agenda. Whether or not that is at any particular conference, just take it a little more broadly. Bridgetown has evolved somewhat since it first came about, and I think that that's a natural and a logical thing for it to do. We've had some successes. There's been progress. There's greater uptake of SDRs. We are seeing more attention being paid and more interest in.
Can you put it closer?
Yes, closer. And more interest, more uptake in terms of debt swaps, in terms of climate resilient debt clauses. We had a couple of events, and they were a little technical earlier today about both of those topics, sort of dissecting, the nuances of them rather than having them be one size fits all. And I think that's an important part of where things go. Okay, so more debt swaps, more pause clauses. Okay, great, more interest, more uptake. But how do we do them in such a way that, what's the difference between the ones that work and the ones that don't work? And how do we do them to have maximum impact? So I think sort of getting a little more granular on some of the issues is part of the path forward, but also sort of seeing where there's been progress and then where there needs to be more progress, and just sort of shifting focus. So not changing anything, but understanding, okay, well, it's a pretty normal thing. You sort of look back, monitoring and evaluation, how have things gone and what makes sense to do next. So support the things that are working, and then where there's a need to push harder on something or course correct a little bit to say, all right, we need to maybe focus a little more on this, or maybe there's a different angle on that, to just keep the work going. But the overall idea that there is reform needed for the international financial architecture, and that it's something that we're looking at systemically, that remains. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Karima. Would any of the others like to respond? You're okay. Are there any more questions from the audience at this stage? Yes. Please, here at the front. I'm not too sure where the microphone is.
There he is. He's here.
Aha.
Thank you. Can you hear me? This is very weird. I hear him in this ear and I hear myself in this ear. Okay. I think I have two questions. So the first one, I mean, because we're talking about finance and better and feminist finance for like on this Gender Day. So one thing that was mentioned by Ricardo, and I do go along with this call for like keep pushing for women's rights and for marginalized communities and doing all of that, but like this work is it's triggering, it's frustrating, it's hard on most of us because most of the people who do that work are marginalized and affected themselves. So we're asked to do more and we need to go into the finance space and we need to go into agriculture and like we're in all of these spaces, but we're underpaid, we're overworked. So how do we challenge that? I mean, yeah, I know there's no easy answer to that, but I think it's more of like rather than a question, a sharing of like frustration and desperation because we're like we need to do all of this work, but how? And how can we continue to it because we're all gonna go home from this COP probably being burned out, hungry, sleep deprived, and so on. And I think the second question is more like a lot of the countries. I talked to a fellow activist from Denmark, and there's already a discussion going on that the money that Denmark pledges to climate finance will be taken away from development aid. In Germany, we see similar trends, so that countries kind of tell the story of how they're championing at climate finance, but there's never new money. It's always money being taken away from other, and I'm very critical towards development aid, but let's just leave that for another day. But so that the money is not taken away from other sectors, other important work that has been done, and that's also money that's without restrictions and it's not project work again. So it's just like just give the money without having any rules of how to spend it, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. So that's two questions. Tetet, I'm looking at you. Would you like to respond to either or both of them?
Okay. I think that's the whole point why developing countries are insisting that climate finance should be new and additional. Because we know the story. No? It's being double, triple, quadruple counted. It's not just development aid, but also humanitarian assistance. Even in-country refugee costs are labeled as climate finance. So that shouldn't be the case. There should be a clear firewall between what is development finance and what is climate finance. But of course, it doesn't serve developed countries' interest if there is a clear firewall, no? So I think what we need to do is to really expose what is happening. That I think we have a lot of incredible evidence already coming from civil society research, etc., that would need to challenge the dominant narrative coming out from OECD reports that climate finance has actually been met and exceeded. No? So that's a lot of false narratives that we need to challenge constantly.
Thank you very much, Tetet. And then there's still the first question about increasing workload and leaving COP frustrated, which I think many of us can identify with, who maybe haven't been here the first time.
I'm not frustrated when I leave the COP.
You're not frustrated?
I'm not. Because I know that this space there's a lot of political economy dynamics going on. And for us to pin our hopes solely on this process, that's kind of deceiving ourselves, no? Misleading ourselves. Because my framework is, I come here knowing full well that rich countries will always bully their way out of stepping up to their historical responsibility. And we know that this UN space is captured by corporate interests. We have many more fossil fuel lobbyists than indigenous peoples in this space. So I think at the end of the day, once we're clear about the political economy of this space, we will also be clear about the limits that this space can offer. And then we go back to our communities feeling more energized that real change can only happen from below. When we hold our governments accountable, then that's what they bring to the global level. But for us to think that the global level can do wonders and change the system, I think that's a formula for frustration. I come home from COPs energized, sad but energized because it affirms our fundamental belief in movements, in people power.
Thank you very much, Tet.
So don't be sad.
Maybe I won't go home from COP frustrated this year. Are there any more questions at this stage? We're slightly over time already. So there is one more question. Karima.
Not really a question. I just wanted to say very quickly that I'm very happy that for us in the Barbados Pavilion that we could
Closer to your mouth. Yeah.
that we could host an event with such a diversity of views being expressed and this type of conversation. It's a little different from a lot of the other events that we've had and that we have planned, which I think is a good thing. And it's interesting to hear the different views expressed. I can tell that we don't agree with each other on every single point, but I think that that is a good thing, and I'm happy that we could host the discussion and hear the diversity of views. So I just wanted to say that as we are about to wrap up, and thank you for planning the event with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's been really nice, and thank you very much for having us, even though there are a divergence of views in some aspects, but I also think a confluence in many others.
Yes.
That leaves me to say thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much to my wonderful panelists with whom I had the privilege of sharing the stage this evening. And yeah, we have one more event on Bridgetown in exactly 1 week, which you're all more than welcome to come to as well. We'll be sharing all the information for that presently. But with that, I think I'll close. Thank you very much.